tools in order to live in harmony with the earth. Their lifestyle revolves around an understanding of the interconnectedness between humans and the environment, fostering a sustainable relationship of give and take. Indigenous heritage is also grounded in community and togetherness that modern societies now lack significantly. This collective mindset has been instrumental in preserving their rich cultural traditions and ancestral lands, despite the persistent challenges posed by imperialist systems that seek to override their traditional knowledge and displace them from their territories. They're focused on progressing together as one whole community rather than silos or different parts is inspiring and an approach that climate justice also strives to take. So today we are joined by three panelists, and our first is P.I. Christo Adonis, who is a shaman of the First Peoples. He is descended from the Cariña and Nepuyo peoples of Trinidad and Tobago. He practices traditional indigenous medicine and is an environmentalist, a tour guide, chocolatier, a master weaver, and an ardent nature lover. P.I. Adonis was also a supervisor with the Trinidad and Tobago National Reforestation and Watershed Rehabilitation Program for 17 years. He has made it a priority to pass on the traditional knowledge of his ancestors to the youth, including basket weaving and other traditional forms of weaving. Welcome. Our second panelist is Mrs. Cynthia Ellis-Topsy. Mrs. Topsy is the Ambassador at Large for the Garifuna Nation of Belize, a cultural ambassador for Belize and an environmental activist in rainforest preservation. Her activism has been grounded on intentionally breaking cycles for present and future generations, where she finds passion from engagement and mentoring of youth leadership. Mrs. Topsy also addresses climate change issues from an Indigenous perspective, including forest gardening and milpa cycle regeneration for food sovereignty. Delivered by a Maya midwife, she captures the essence of Garifuna indigeneity and is a mother of 5 children and 17 grandchildren. She is also the widow of Harriet Topsy, who formerly ran the archaeological sites for the country. And her goal is the repatriation of the Garifuna's treasures and global engagement of Indigenous peoples on these matters. Our final panelist is Ms. Caroline Mayer-Toby. Ms. Mayer-Toby is the founding director for the Institute for Small Islands and an attorney at law at Mayer and Company. She is a director on the Fons Amandes Reforestation Community Project Board and the Caribbean lead for the Ocean for Ecocide Law Network, a partnership between Stop Ecocide International, Gallifrey Foundation, and the Institute. Ms. Mayer-Toby is also the former Chief Empowerment Officer for She Changes Climate Change and a delegate with the Trinidad and Tobago delegation to COP27 Egypt 2022 and COP28 Dubai 2023. She has been advising at the climate negotiations since 2011 with First Foundation for International Environmental Law and Development, and then Legal Response International, facilitating legal and technical advice to small island developing states, least developed countries, and civil societies, including Indigenous peoples. She's working on climate and environmental justice and Indigenous rights issues, collaborating at the intersection of governments, business, NGOs, and Indigenous stakeholders from not only the Greater Caribbean Basin, but also with First Nations in Amazon, Latin America, Australia, and Kenya. She focuses on these rights in litigation, diplomacy, and negotiations. Welcome to all three of our panelists, and thank you so much for being here with us today. And I won't take up any more time because I want to give you ample time to share your stories. So I will start off with P.I. Adonis.
Mabrika, greetings. I bring greetings from the First Peoples of Arima and by extension Trinidad and Tobago. It's an honor being invited to take part in this so important topic and well-being of our world. I start off by saying goal of the Indigenous First Peoples It is true to say that indigenous climate action is a way of life for the indigenous peoples of the region. The First Peoples practice a spiritual worldview that all animate and inanimate things on this and all other worlds have a common root and origin. The planet Earth or Mother Earth is given to human beings to live and occupy as caregivers with a human means. Our goal, therefore, is to cultivate a love for Mother Earth in the minds of every sector of the population so that they will respect and treat her well to restore harmony and balance. The biggest challenge remains what it was from the time of conquest.
Hi, Pierre Adonis. Your audio has cut out a bit. I think it might be your connection. You're muted now.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I had to unmute it.
Yes, go ahead. I can hear you now.
Okay. Should I go back a bit?
Sure, yes.
The First Peoples practiced the spiritual worldview that all animate and inanimate things on this and all other worlds have a common root and origin. The planet Earth or Mother Earth is given to human beings to live and occupy as caregivers with an eternal duty to protect and nurture its sacredness. Human beings are allowed to live and produce on the earth only through sustainable means. Our goal, therefore, is to cultivate a love for Mother Earth in the minds of every sector of the population so that they will respect and treat her well to restore harmony and balance. The biggest challenge remains what it was from the time of conquest: irresponsible development that depleted our forests, dammed our waterways, and introduced a production pattern that polluted the air. Other challenges have to do with our geographical location. The Caribbean region is located right in the center of the tropics. Although Trinidad and Tobago have been spared from major hurricanes, every year we prepare for the passage of wider and more powerful hurricanes that threaten the entire region. We suffer from flash floods, earthquakes, intensified hurricane force winds, coastal erosion, major landslides and volcanic eruptions, and in many instances, heavy loss of life and property. As a result, we suffer extensive infrastructural damage to our roads and bridges, agricultural crops, homes, farmhouses, machinery, residential and commercial housing, and the list goes on. In addition, our natural food supplies fall short as wildlife, fish, and traditional agriculture are increasingly affected by climate change. The animals in our forests, which we as First Peoples consider that sharing that space with, is being depleted by a lot of different things. The most important element is empowerment of those impacted by climate change. Action taken should include protection of indigenous or First Peoples' rights, as outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Articles 24, 29, and particularly Article 29. Article 29.1, indigenous peoples have the right to the conservation and protection of the environment and the productive capacity of their lands or territories and resources. States states shall take effective measures to ensure that no storage or disposal of hazardous material shall take place in the lands or territories of indigenous people without their free, prior, and informed consent. States shall also take effective measures to ensure, as needed, that programs for monitoring, maintaining, and restoring the health of indigenous people as developed and implemented by the peoples affected by such materials are duly implemented. We in Trinidad and Tobago, and in particular, the community of which I am part of and being the PI of, has had an agreement with the government of the state of Trinidad and Tobago, whereby we worked in ensuring the reforestation of our country. Reforestation that were caused by landslides and by extension by men who, with what we call slash and burn and erosion. So we have been doing that for over 18 to 20 years. Not only by reforestation and ensuring that indigenous plants, medicinal and otherwise, remain, because a lot are becoming extinct. But we also create employment for many of the youths in our communities. We try to continue the ways of our ancestors by teaching the youths to do the weaving and other building of indigenous buildings and food, culinary arts of our people. The big countries that has a lot of emission, I think that they should be forced into action by recompensing the indigenous peoples for the damages that they have done. I pray that with actions such as these that we are involved in right now would bear fruits. So I thank you for this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pierre Adonis, and we'll definitely come back to some of the things that you said. But thank you so much for sharing. And we'll move on now to Mrs. Topsy. You're on mute.
It's a privilege and an honor to be on this platform. And I want to congratulate the Institute for creating this space of honoring Indigenous people. I just want to clarify that I'm from Belize, I live in Belize. And although Belize is not an island, Belize is very significant in the Caribbean and the Commonwealth for contributing a unique dynamic in the conversation. And I'm Garifuna and also Maya. And I want to present that in honoring those who came before us, the original people, the first peoples of the region. Garifuna, interestingly enough, our homeland is St. Vincent, Urume, which is the only country in the Caribbean which has a national hero that is indigenous. That is Sovereign King and Chief Joseph Chatouillet, who was the leader who resisted enslavement and suppression by the colonial structures. And he fought such a strong resistance that the colonizers succumbed and came up with an agreement where our people would be exiled to Central America. And we were first put on an island across St. Vincent called Balisau, and we were left to die. We were genocided, and half of the people who were placed on that island for some time died. And the other half of us, over 2,000, were transported in boats to Central America, to Honduras, to Roatan. And we survived. We more than survived. We are a miracle. The United Nations declared Garifuna in 2001. UNESCO declared us a masterpiece culture for humanity because we still maintain our customs, our language, our way of being. The beautiful part of the journey, the pilgrimage as we call it, is that when we were originally captured for enslavement, we were brought or taken care of by the Caribs, and we were called Black Caribs. At one point, we call ourselves Garifuna. We start to articulate for ourselves who we are. And there are now over nearly 1 million of us in the world. And that is a miracle because the unity of who we are is a testament to the consistency, I don't want to use the word survival because we more than survived. Anywhere you meet a Garifuna, we have many things in common. So I wanted to also acknowledge the Maya because we are in Central America, in Belize, and the colonizers, the Roman Catholic Church, saw it useful to have the Garifuna develop schools all over the country of Belize. The uniqueness of that experience is that we came to align with the first peoples of Central America. So Belize has a very unique positioning where we are the only English-speaking country in Central America, and we are also part of the Caribbean, and therefore we are also part of the Commonwealth. So that I wanted to present because that gives us a unique opportunity to leverage indigeneity from different forms. Now, a number of projects and programs are developed throughout the region and throughout the world without authentic consultation with Indigenous people. And that is what I want to focus on more, because what the brother shared earlier on, I'm not going to repeat what he shared, but I want to contribute other perspectives which are important for our consideration. We have hundreds of archaeological sites in Belize, and therefore Belize offers a gift to the rest of the region and the world in terms of guiding us on how to build on the Indigenous knowledge and practice relating to a number of the concerns that the world is facing. We do not have to reinvent the wheel because the Maya had, for example, very unique ways of relating to nature, relating to the world. And my first recommendation as we move forward is to access and engage with these treasures and this body of knowledge and practice, specifically from the Maya and the Garifuna, in guiding programs, policies, and strategies. Just to mention, for example, that the Maya, and I should say that in Belize we have three versions of Maya. We have the Yucatec, closer to Mexico. We have the Mopan, and we have the Quechua. And there are several other groups of Maya in Central America, but I won't go into that. But the Maya were in the region for thousands of years, and they were able to sustain a number of communities and population for water, for shade, for food. We don't say food security, we say food sovereignty. So before the United Nations developed the language about sustainable development, our people had the capacity, had the knowledge, had the way of sustaining ourselves, and we still do. And therefore, I'm very thankful that several institutions are now beginning to engage with us in terms of the way forward. In honoring us, however, I would like to see an acknowledgement, an affirmation, apology to our people. What that means is, first of all, acknowledge that this is the land that others found the land. They found us on the land, and in the decolonization process and the deconstruction process, apologize and acknowledge that we have been wronged. And we can, in our relationship, go through a process of healing, of forgiveness, of transformation. In this specific process, I would like to note that in the case of Belize, many of the researchers that come from different parts of the world concerning the way of life of our indigenous people are not indigenous people. They are not indigenous. They are not even African. The researchers who come to Belize are mostly white, and I have encouraged a conversation whereby we change that narrative, where we can have, it's not just about color, it's about mindset. Because I just recently attended a conference in New Orleans with over 2,000 archaeologists, and I searched for indigenous and for archaeologists of color, and I hardly found any. And when I found a few, I asked them, could you please come to the region where we are indigenous and where we are people of color, so that we can diversify the conversation. And so that is one recommendation I would like us to make in the region of the Caribbean, in the regions of the Commonwealth. It would be great if we could involve a conversation with indigenous professionals. And what do I mean by professionals? Let me give an example of the Maya in Belize. There is an archaeological site that I am involved in. It's called El Pilar. There are about 5,000 acres of monuments, resources that we share between Belize and Guatemala in terms of the colonial definition, right? And these sites are being studied by researchers from the United States, and we are very thankful for the information. All the artifacts, or many of the artifacts, have been exported to the United States and to Canada. And so the people who are excavating the remains on these sites are Maya, the very people on whose land the research is being done. So I made a recommendation that if researchers are getting their information from the original people, then there should be credit given to them. As a result of this conversation, the University of California, Santa Barbara honored a Maya leader who was involved in this process and declared him a citizen scientist. It is this kind of affirmation and honor and respect that I would like to see us dialogue more with in institutions of the region and the Commonwealth. I was very thankful to meet some relatives, they are called Aboriginals from Australia at this conference. And their presence there was to provide information and to invite archaeologists from around the world to Australia to shift and to change the conversation. Finally, I would like to propose that in terms of climate change issues, those have been studied extensively by many agencies. But I would like to see, in terms of the future and for the children and generations to come, that we include in our curriculum and in our way of being and in our way of redefining education, that our world, the world of indigeneity, be honored as an open classroom, that our knowledge and our practice is included as a part of the curriculum. Our knowledge of the seas, our knowledge of the rivers, our knowledge of the earth, our relationship with the earth, our knowledge of the coast be affirmed and included as different ways of knowing, as different ways of being. For example, as the Hopi people here, I'm here in the United States, they offer different ways of mapping. That mapping of terrain is not just one way. The mapping is like based on knowledge of what the ancestors gave, where your location of a stone, writing on the wall, different indigenous practices are part of defining the locale. And it's not limited to GPS and more recently LiDAR. Let us offer a complementarity with each other, where, for example, Harvard University has recently accepted the indigenous way of mapping and knowing as a part of their way of learning how to put knowledge and practice together. So there are many creative ways that we can begin to dialogue. I am proud of the St. Vincent people under the leadership of their Prime Minister, who has recently agreed and declared to purchase the island of Balisau. Balisau is the island where the Garifuna people were left to perish, and many of us perished, and many of us more than survived. And that island, which is in private ownership, is being purchased by the government of St. Vincent in partnership and support with the indigenous Garifuna people as a heritage site, a historical monument for our people. Yes, we never forget that we suffered on that island. So I would like to encourage all existing institutions in the region and the world to dialogue with us about different ways of knowing and practice. Just as we were pressured into learning in certain structures called education, let us redefine the process of acknowledging indigenous knowledge and practice in a way of complementary cooperation in addressing the climate change issues. We know about the plants and the birds and the trees and the seas and the rivers. Without compasses, our entire beings are compasses which can help to direct the way forward. So I thank you for this opportunity to share and look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Topsy. That was very intriguing, and your stories, you make a lot of valuable points for sure. And now we're gonna touch on some of those points. Can I invite Mrs. Mayor Toby to come on now and share some of her work and experience working with Indigenous communities?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, great.
You're having a bit of feedback though.
Okay. Let's put it on mute. Yeah, thank you. I'm with the PI right now, so we're hearing a bit of an echo.
Yeah, it's a bit better. Go ahead.
All right, great. Right, how are you? My name is Caroline Mayer Toby. I am the, can you turn it down a bit? Maybe, is that? Thank you. Is that better? Can you hear me now?
What you can probably do is lower your volume a little bit.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
All right, great. Hi, so yes, and I was introduced before. I don't need to introduce myself again. My experiences, I'm just going to go with the questions that I have here and answer them. My experiences working with Indigenous communities came about, I might have to go a little bit back and explain what I was doing before. As was explained, I was advising small island developing states and least developed countries of the UNFCCC, the climate negotiations, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it just kept on occurring to me that my people weren't represented in the work that I was doing. So small islands and Indigenous peoples, I could not see, and I think I started around 2009, I just couldn't see a lot of reference to them in the Paris Agreement didn't exist then, but in the Framework Convention. And anything was very, very negligible. So for me, when I came back to Trinidad around 2017, I really wanted to get Indigenous peoples a seat at the table. I wanted to somehow get them to the conference and speak, and they've been doing that on their own. But this was 2017. This was before the pandemic, so it was happening less. I started the Institute with that idea in mind, and maybe using the LCP portal, the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples portal. And I realized that they had another plan for me. So I linked up with Mama Akila. She is the Paramount Chief of the Americans in Trinidad. And she was like, right. That sounds very interesting, Dave. But what we're going to do is this. So thank goodness for Mama Akila and showing me the right way. And we eventually ended up back to the climate change conference. What we started doing was working on rights, because there's no point in going to a conference and talking about environmental devastation if you can't talk about the rights of Indigenous peoples and what they've lost over the centuries and what they're entitled to now. So we actually started going to the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues and the UN Permanent Forum for Persons of African Descent. One of the issues that we were working on was a kind of a mainstream acceptance of the indigeneity of Afro-Indigenous peoples. And the UN has been a huge supporter of that. So that is well on its way. But that was something that was very much not seen, because there's a very uniform view of indigeneity, and people see it as a kind of Amazonian indigeneity, but Indigenous peoples are all over the world. So there are millions of Indigenous people all over the world. And right now, more than ever, they are speaking at the top of their voices. They are calling out for justice. They are calling out for reparations. And they are calling out for us to understand that the world is in danger. And we kind of understand that and we get the notes, but they live with nature. They live on an intimate basis with nature. They understand nature like the back of their hand, way more than anyone in Western society, away, standing with a barricade between us and nature, can understand. So that segues into the next question. How can Indigenous practices be impactful in adapting to climate change, and especially in a broader scope? And I'll go into the work that I've been doing along the way. I'm still answering the first question as we go along. I think this is how we can do it. In these conversations that the Ramphal Institute is having right now, these are how we do it. It's not just talk shop, it's understanding perspectives respectfully, with great deference, and without a pillaging of intellectual property, obviously. It is important to sit down with Indigenous peoples, as it is now starting, I think, in a more significant way, not to just collect their knowledge, but to understand where they are coming from. You see, what's happening here is that there are two worlds intersecting. It's a pluriverse. They're two plural, they're more than what they're not two plural. They're plural societies existing in the same space that does not allow for more than one society to exist. So if you think of it as like a Venn diagram, you know, it's just kind of like one and then one, there's no intersection, there's no overlapping. One way looks at the natural world as resources, something to collect, to hoard, to store up and store for later. The other society, the other worldview looks at it as we are all one family. The birds are family. The jaguar is family. The river is family. Water is alive. Water holds memory, not in a goop way, not in a Gwyneth Paltrow way, but in a very, very real way. And we need to understand that there is magic. There are ancestors. There is a spirit realm. There are traditions. There is hierarchy. And it is very real. And it is very strict and is very fierce. There are consequences. If you dam that river, there are consequences. If you kill that forest, there are consequences. And this is what we do not understand, the consequences, the 7 generations down the line. This is what they understand intimately, and this is what they have been navigating for millennia to keep the ecosystem alive. Because if you just go and pillage and pillage and pillage, you will have a desert. We will be returned to our original state before we left the ocean. And that sounds kind of extreme, but there was nothing before animals left the ocean. When trees colonized the land, when plants colonized the land, they brought the water with it. Trees keep water in the earth. Trees bring animals. So we cannot exist without trees. We think that we can decimate the trees and put down a palace, but we don't understand that we then have to truck supplies in and resources in from another area. And that's what's going on along the world. That's what the supply chain is, the supply chains. So what is it? With the end of the supply chains for, oh gosh, my ESG is not thinking right now, but scope 3 emissions, for example. And at the end of the supply chain, we think of the world being connected by these supply chains. And these supply chains are actually what's doing damage, because we are not limiting ourselves. We are not understanding that if you take everything, nothing can replenish. So the world is slowly starting to get to this. But the way that they're doing it is very heavy-handed. This whole green transition is exceedingly colonial. And this is what we have to do. So how to, I'm going to jump down to challenging, this is the last question, challenges to implementing regenerative and inclusive public policy practices. Because what I said is, how can Indigenous practices be impactful in adapting to climate change, and especially in a broader scope? They need to have a seat at the table. Indigenous peoples need to have a seat at the table. The LC portal, no offense to the LC portal, I'm sure they're wonderful people there, wonderful people working, and it has its role, but it's an insult. You cannot conflate Indigenous peoples and local communities. That gives local communities who do not have the same ancestral rights to the land equivalent permission to say yes to an extractive community, extractive corporation. And then they say, well, we got permission. We got permission from those people over there. And they're like, they came like 500 years ago. They weren't from here. So do you understand what I mean? That it's an insult, because it opens a loophole to stop everything that they're fighting against. To open up a loophole to start everything that they're trying to stop, that they're trying to fight against, that the LC portal is there to design. Sorry? Oh. I think I have how much time left?
About 5 minutes or so, but I think you just had an echo.
I see. Okay, gotcha. So, where was I? Right. So I've completely lost my train of thought, but what I was going to say is how to create Right. How to create transformative public policies that are sustainable, acknowledged balance of people and nature, similar to Indigenous practices. So this is what I'm talking about with the seats at the table. It needs to be, all right, let's take the climate change conference, for example. It's rapidly becoming infiltrated by the oil lobby. That's a bit of a bomb of a statement to say here. It is alleged that it is rapidly becoming infiltrated by the oil lobby, right? Now, the oil lobby can come in and have a really powerful impact on climate change negotiations. I'm not going to go into that statement. That will take me much further down the garden path. These nations that are sitting down at the table negotiating where we should go as a world, these nations are young. Indigenous nations, Indigenous sovereign nations go back millennia. These nations have come at the expense of Indigenous nations. These nations are often colonial settler nations that are imposed upon the existing communities that lived there before. It is no longer colonialism in such a name, but this is the residue. How can we create transformative public policies that are sustainable and acknowledge the balance of people and nature? Give Indigenous peoples a seat at the table at these negotiations. Full stop. Respect-free, prior, informed consent. Engage them in everything you do. Ask them permission of what they can, what can be done on their land. So, examples of these types of policies and work that we've done. Very few. Very, very few. I can tell you things that Indigenous communities do that would be very useful to implement right now. The American community, Mama Akila Jaramogi, Akila Jaramogi Fonsamans, is trying to create a national bushfire policy and legislation. She's trying to bring it to the government. For example, one of the practices she does is a gayap. A gayap is it is an Indigenous practice. It is when, for example, you want to build something communal or not. You bring the community to you. You know, bring them in with food and lime and music and entertainment and stuff like that, and you do the work together as a community, and then you feed them. So that's the tiny example of a guy up. So they do a guy up several times a year to once or several times a year, depending on the year, to clear fire traces. And you can see this in Australian Indigenous practices as well. Clearing the fire traces can prevent something like, say, Maui from happening in Trinidad, where Maui collapsed in fire. Although we won't go into Maui right now. But that is one of those examples that very, very easy to take on board. Have a bushfire policy, take these practices into consideration, take what they are doing to deal with it into consideration. So I think I'm done for time now, but I just want to wrap up with saying what the Institute, and to answer what the Institute at the first question is doing with Indigenous communities. We're working on litigation to deal with everything that I talked about before. We're dealing with litigation, we're dealing with diplomacy, and we're dealing with negotiations. So negotiations would be like contractual negotiations. So if the University of X that came to us, for example, wants to engage with Indigenous peoples, we're right there. And we're making sure that they look at everything, that FPIC is respected, that if they are getting money for this project, how much of it is going to the university, how much of it is going to the staff, is any going to the people on the Indigenous team, are the Indigenous people on the team authors of this project, are the holders of the knowledge, who holds the knowledge, who holds the intellectual property of the country, is it conflicting with anything that they can do? Things like that. Litigation, we are working on issues of protecting the environment, protecting against exploitation. We are working with the Afro-Indigenous community in protecting a coral reef and seagrass beds. I'm not going to say where. We've not filed this yet. Diplomacy, every year we support Indigenous peoples going to the UNFCCC, the climate negotiations, the UN Permanent Forum for Persons of African Descent, and the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues. It's not all three every year, but we have a record of supporting, of getting funding, of helping write speeches, of training young lawyers, training young reporters, and we are working on training interpreters. Because right now, what we need to do and what we need to have is all hands on deck, helping Indigenous peoples speak, amplify their voices, get to places where their voices can be heard, and protecting them from being deemed tourists. Indigenous children are not terrorists. Indigenous children are not terrorists for protecting their lands and their ancestral title. So this is where we are. This is where we have to be. We have to enable the most vulnerable and the most powerful people on our planet. We have to help them help us protect the environment, because we can't do it on our own without them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Mayor Toby. Very, very key insights there. You touched on something in particular, this idea of ensuring that Indigenous voices have a seat at the table. And Ms. Topsy, you also talked about attending a conference recently. When you're in these spaces, how do these conferences act as a medium for you to amplify your voice? Are you being heard, or?
Well, very important question. Honestly, at one point, I refused to go to the United Nations, not because I don't respect the United Nations, but because it felt like going around in circles, meaning that I noticed some of my colleagues, Indigenous colleagues, fighting to get a voice in, and for me that was very humiliating. But anyway, the point is that we as Indigenous people need to affirm the fact that we were here before and therefore take leadership in creating our own spaces and having our voices heard, in addition to being in the space of the colonialists, right? We are in a decolonization process. Recently, when I went to the meeting in New Orleans, I felt like a pearl, like a black pearl in a ocean, a white ocean. And it felt very important to me, like my presence or the presence of people of color spoke for itself. And it felt like something was accomplished, like we were making a first step. So I like to look at this situation in a realistic manner, meaning that we've come a very, very long way, you know? And I was able to speak, and I didn't say a lot, on a panel, meaning that in terms of archaeology, for example, we have Belizean archaeologists. And because I live in Belize, I did not have the sense of what the culture and reality of these anthropologists and archaeologists are until when I went to this meeting. My big question was, where are the Caribbean scholars in this conversation? I know that in the case of Belize, we won the Maya land rights case. We challenged our government for the lands of the Maya people, you know, and we won. We didn't win in Belize, but we won in the Caribbean Court of Justice. So that's very encouraging, you know, and we need to have more conversations like that, like this. We need to challenge each other. We need to look in the mirror at our institutions that are supposedly representing us and don't be guided by the reference of other institutions that are organized for their own purposes. So I agree that we should come around the table, their table, but we also need to create our table.
Thank you. And when we're talking about Indigenous communities and amplifying Indigenous voices, I think it's very important to also pinpoint exactly how we can have productive and meaningful discussions and not just have Indigenous voices come to these places and these spaces and not move forward. And in terms of the climate and how it's changing, P.I. Adonis, how have you seen climate change impact your environment and your community? And any recommendations from you on how you can combat that?
Well, as I mentioned, in our community, what you will call land-based agriculture people and so on. And with the deforestation and building of housing and a lot of quarrying and so on, it encroaches on the land of the indigenous people, the lands that were occupied, that were used for agriculture and so on. And so that has a lot effect, and less food, you will say. And so we are involved, as I told you, in reforestation. And our community recently was granted a piece of land from the state, which is not much, but on that space, we encourage the young members to go learn the practice habits of our ancestors, the practice that we did without having too much chemical and so on, and also in building indigenous houses. And we hope by that, and by talking of that, that the larger society, because we are a small community within the wider community of Trinidad and Tobago. But we hope by what we are doing, it would be an initiative whereby the wider society would look upon our practices and so on, and so help out our nation. Because I'm not speaking only of the indigenous people of Trinidad now, I'm talking about Trinidad and Tobago. Because we have to think in a holistic manner. So we think the practices that we do, it would better help out the situation of where there's flooding and landslides and those sort of things in Trinidad and Tobago. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
And before I go, I want Sister Cynthia. It seems as though the creator, Tamushi, the creator, has given me the opportunity to meet my sisters from Belize. I met last night, I shared a space with one, Sister Lucia. She and I, that's another thing that I was to add on what I'm saying. She and I is teaching people interested in indigenous traditional medicine and so on. And we spoke about you, Sister Cynthia.
That is very beautiful. And that's what I meant specifically in terms of being strategic, you know. I want to honor, Lucia is my sister, my physical sister, and I want to honor those who came before us, our father. The Garifuna people are intentional, and I'm not being arrogant. I'm just saying that we have a lot to share in terms of moving the way forward, you know, and connect as one, unifying our efforts, you know, that we can. I mean, this is all strategic, it's not accidental, the way how it is unfolding around the world, you know. So we can learn a lot from each other, and collectively, we can offer to the world, as Sister Carolyn said, a template for moving forward. You know, we've been like in Suriname, for example, with the Maroons. There are people who come from different universities to learn from the indigenous people. These are the doctors, right? Who don't know how to do bone setting the way how the Maroons in the rainforest know, right? And so one of the things we have work to do strategically in this conversation as we go around the table. You understand? We have to establish our protocols, not run after other people's ways of being, which is okay, it's useful, but they never have that orientation that we have been guided with. I'm very proud of Belize in the sense that they have Garifuna Settlement Day. The whole country celebrates us. So things like that, movements like that, is a tangible indication of the love and the seriousness with which our people are being considered.
Thank you, Mrs. Topsy. Okay, we'll move into a couple of questions. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please just drop it in the chat. And I see that Ms. King, you have your hand up. Just go ahead.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to this amazing conversation. My comments are directed specifically to our senior ancestor, Cynthia Topsy. And I want you to know that we have established a climate consortium where all Black women from different areas, including the Caribbean, and the diaspora. All of us have, as you have commented, we are all scholars. We all have masters, PhD, law degrees in these areas. Hello? Did something just happen? We are here for the exact reason that you just expressed. We think that it should be okay for us to be both Indigenous and incredibly smart. We're good at this work. It's all the work that we want to do around climate change, sea level rise, regenerative farming, agriculture, all of those areas. We have been quietly advocating for an increase in representation. And to your point, yes, we have a tough time dealing with being marginalized. So now we have established this global consortium of other people who look like us, who have those credentials. Our job now is to find each of you and ask you, how can we help?
Thank you so much for that. And
Yes.
if you have any of the resources, like your website, and you want to drop that in the chat, we would love to see more of your work and what you're doing.
Please, you can share my number in the chat. Well, Carolyn is the person who contacted me, but I want to just comment on what you said quickly, that it was such a gap in our journey in Belize. I never in all these years, as my husband was the head of archaeology for the country, saw a person of color come to the country. And so it concerned me so much that I came this time to this country to search for people of color, because I'm sure you exist. And the first one I met, I grabbed their hand at the conference and said, thank goodness. It's so good to know that you exist, because I've never seen you in our country. And this is not to be disrespectful in a way, but to be real. Every single researcher that has come to Belize, and I know, is not of color. Every single one. And so we are breaking the cycle now, and it's very beautiful. And as a Caribbean, Latin American person, that's the uniqueness of Belize, I'm holding us accountable too. I'm not going to be critiquing other people and not do my part in terms of reaching out. So thank you so much for being available.
Carolyn invited us, so I know that Carolyn will make it possible to help you in any way that we can. And at the same time, we're going to make it possible for Carolyn to join us and to give us her voice.
Let me just say one thing though. We help each other, because during the time of COVID, my ancestors called me to come to this country to learn about you. I came in search of you. I've always been in search of you. And these ancestors allowed me to travel from Florida to Niagara Falls, like the Underground Railroad. And when I stopped at the Museum of the Enslaved, I think it was Montgomery somewhere, everywhere I went, I came to the conclusion that you all are a nation. So I started to change from saying that the Garifuna nation, we have never been enslaved. However, when I had the experience of journeying here, I realized that you are overcomers and you need to speak and share that with us, and don't be shy and come and look for us, okay? And be with us. And in terms of being a scholar, the citizen scientist, I went to the University of California. I went there. I didn't wait for them to come to us. I went to the chancellor of the university during the height of COVID, and I spoke with him and said to him, our people have contributed to making your people get your doctorates and so on and so forth. doesn't that mean that then our people are more than qualified? So the person, the leader who got the Citizen Award never finished high school, okay? So he got the first award from the Chancellor of the University of Santa Barbara, California, Santa Barbara, Narciso Torres. And we as Indigenous people started off by calling him doctor. We gave him the doctorate. And he never entered any of these institutions here. So we can be creative, and assertive.
Thank you very much. And thank you again, Ms. King, for offering that. Like I said, we're happy to find out more about what you're doing and the resources that are available to the Indigenous communities and everybody who's interested in learning about that. And one last thing I want to touch on before we end, we just have maybe a few more minutes, but the idea also of Indigenous professionals. Miss Mirtobi, can you speak to that a little bit? Because I know me and you had spoken about that also. But what are the resources available to help people become Indigenous professionals? Because there's not a lot available.
There are organizations. Are you hearing? Okay, yeah. My colleague is going to help. There are organizations such as our own, the Institute for Small Islands, also the. Let me just move over here. Sorry.
If everyone can also mute themselves, I think that might be better.
Yeah, that's what we're doing. Yeah. So there's the Institute for Small Islands. Contact us. We will help you. There's Cultural Survival. There's Survival International. If you look up Indigenous organizations, the Indian Collective in the US, they
can everyone please
actually
mute
have
their mics? Thank you.
They actually have started a system of loans and grants. I think loans. So there are places where you can get knowledge. You can get mapping of Indigenous communities. In terms of professionals, there are universities. I know Phoenix University, Phoenix and Arizona, University of Phoenix, University of Arizona. One of them has a Indigenous rights, an Indigenous studies program. There are several Indigenous studies programs in the university in the United States. Google them. Just Google Indigenous undergraduate and postgraduate studies. And yeah, and basically to be an Indigenous professional, I mean, you just have to be Indigenous and be a professional and bring your worldview and be an Indigenous person in a community, connected to the community. And yeah, so there are many Indigenous professionals, and it is basically linking communities right now. That is the issue, making sure nobody gets left behind, making sure that we reach out to the global South, which is a problematic term, I know, but I'm still using it on purpose here to show that it is more difficult to connect to these channels if you are in the global South, if you're an Indigenous person, versus being in the States or Europe or something like that. I just wanted to say one thing quickly before I went. Carbon markets, biodiversity markets. Be careful about them. Somebody asked, why is the green transition colonial? This is why. Because if you want to see what's happening, and I say this all the time, I think I should stitch it on a pillow. If you want to see what's happening, what happened when Columbus hit the shores, if you want to see what's happening when first contact happened, go right now to the Congo. Go right now to the Amazon. Go right now to first contact that is happening again. This is Pizarro, this is Cortez, this is Columbus all over again. Because they are taking lands, they are evicting people, they are killing people. Not so much with the green transition, but it has been happening with other forms of exploitation. And this is a form of exploitation. If you don't have the permission, it is exploitation. Full stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I definitely think that's a good point. Whenever we talk about climate justice, that's what it encompasses as well, to make sure that climate change and fixing climate change, well, not fixing climate change, but our adaptation and mitigation efforts don't perpetuate already unequal political and socio-economic inequalities that already exist in many industries and countries and communities. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you especially to our 3 panelists. Thank you for taking the time out to share your stories, your experiences, and your background. It is always valuable to hear about your experiences as they are unique, and your culture as well, as they are very unique. And thank you also to the Institute for Small Islands and the director as well for helping us put this webinar together. And thank you again for joining us. Our last webinar in the Climate Justice and the Commonwealth series takes place on Thursday. I'm just gonna drop the link in the chat here. If you're interested in that, we're gonna talk about practical solutions for climate justice and moving forward. And that will end off our series. So thank you so much.